Welcome to the online class lecture of Professor S.K. Paul, HOD, University Department of English, BRA, Bihar University, Muzaffarpur. Dear students of PhD course work, first of all, I would like to say good afternoon to you. Today, I am going to deliver my lecture on the topic the language of poetry. Actually, this essay is this lecture is specified. It is specified for your way of for the way you undertake your research work through discussing different dimensions of poetry. So I'm going to start right now. Um, One way of defining poetry is to say that that it uses language to condense experience into an intensely concentrated package with each sound, each word, each image, and each line carrying great weight. Kirchner and Mendel told in 2001. Widdowson in 1992 states that poetry is the expression of all manner of imaginative insight, of subtle thought, and profound feeling, but it has no subject matter of its own. What is remarkable about poetry is the way it makes significant the significant, trivial, and commonplace. The content of the poems is generally speaking unimpressive. Propositions like time passes, being in love is a wonderful feeling, nature is beautiful, and life is lonely are very common in poetry. By themselves, they are of little significance. The essentials of poetry lie in the way a language is used to elaborate on such simple propositions so that they are reformulated in unfamiliar terms which somehow capture the underlying mystery of the commonplace. Terms like literary language and poetic language are closely used to refer to the use of language in literature in general and poetry in particular. In this regard, in this regard, Simpson in 1997 rules out the existence of a literary language. That is, there are no items of modern English vocabulary or grammar that are inherently and exclusively literary. He argues literary discourse, rather than manifesting a uniform language variety, derives its effectiveness from its exploitation of the entire linguistic repertoire. Literary communication thrives not on the presence of a clearly defined linguistic code, but on the very absence of such a code. Simpson explains that poets' devices such as wordplay, punning, and rhyming cited as peculiar to literature. Advertising discourse, for example, depends for much of its impact on memorable or startling figures of speech, the sort of figures the sorts of figures of speech that are often thought the exclusive domain of poetry. A useful tool with which to make comparisons between literary texts and other genres of language is the concept of register. This is a valuable term which links variation in language to variation in situation. A register is defined according to the use to which language is being put. In other words, a register shows what a speaker or writer is going with language at a given moment. In more formal terms, a register is a fixed pattern of vocabulary and grammar which regularly co-occurs with and is conventionally associated with a specific context. Registers are often easily recognized, although it is an axiom in language study that certain communicative contexts regularly predict certain registers. A notable exception is literary communication. Literature is simply not a register of language. This is an enabling feature of literary discourse because it shakes itself free of the strictures imposed by a register. Literary discourse, moreover, has the capacity to assimilate and absorb registers, producing complex and multi layered patterns of communication. This feature of assimilating other registers and varieties is called re registration. The notion of re registration means that no single word or stylistic feature or register will be barred from admission to a literary context. Registers such as legal language or the language of instructions are recognized by the neat fit between a language form and a specific function. But any language at all can be deployed to literary effect by the process of re-registration. Uh, for example, uh, for example, Auden makes use of bureaucratic registers in this poem. In his poem, "The Unknown Citizen," a wide use of journalistic and historical discourse styles is made in such novels as Salman Rushdie's Midnight Children, published in 1981, and Shame, 1983, published in 1983, and in numerous novels by Norman Mailer. Re-registration recognizes that the full, unrestricted resources of the language are open to exploitation for literary ends. In what follows, an account is given of what scholars have claimed to be linguistic peculiarities of the language used in poetry. Mukrowski in 1970 sheds some light on the distinctiveness of poetic language by comparing it to the standard language. First, concerning the relationship between the two, he does not consider poetic language a brand of the standard because he argues poetic language has at its disposal, from the standpoint of lexicon, syntax, etc., all the forms of the given language. However, he remarks that they are closely connected uh, um, uh, in that closely connected in that form in that for poetry um, for poetry the standard language is um, the background against which is reflected the aesthetically um, intentional distortion of the linguistic components of the work, the intentional violation of the norm of the standard. Second, as for the function of the two forms of language, he suggests that the function of poetic language consists in the maximum of foregrounding of the utterance. He asserts foregrounding is the opposite of the automation, that is, the deautomation of an act. The more an act is automatized, the less it is consciously executed. The more it is foregrounded, the more completely conscious it becomes. Automatization schematizes an event. Foregrounding means the violation of the scheme. Standard language does contain examples of foregrounding as in journalistic style or essays. However, in such contexts, it is always subordinate to communication. Its purpose is to attract the reader's or listener's attention more closely to the subject matter expressed by the foregrounded means of expression. In poetic language, foregrounding achieves maximum intensity to the extent of pushing a communication into the background as the objective of expression and of being used for its own sake. It is not used in the services of communication, but in order to place in the foreground the act of expression, the act of speech itself. Halliday in 1971 defines foregrounding as a prominence that is motivated. Patterns of prominence figure out in texts through regularities in the sounds or words or structures that stand out in some way. Motivation is ascribed to prominence if the latter contributes to the writer's total meaning. It does so by virtue and through the medium of its own value in the language through the linguistic function from which its meaning is derived. Where the function is relevant to our interpretation of the work, the prominence will appear as motivated. Halliday mentions two types of prominence: negative, that is, departure from a norm, and positive, which is the attainment or the establishment of a norm. As for departure from a norm, he says it covers both deviations as well as deflections, by which he means departures from some expected pattern of frequency. For Simpson, in 2004, foregrounding refers to a form of textual patterning which is motivated specifically for literary aesthetic purposes. It can appear at any level of language, and it involves a stylistic distortion of some sort, either through an aspect of the text which deviates from a linguistic norm, or alternatively where an aspect of the text is brought to the fore through repetition or a parallelism. That means that foregrounding comes in two main guises: foregrounding as a deviation from a norm, and foregrounding as more of the same. In 1969, Leach indicates uh, obtrusive irregularity, poetic deviation, and obtrusive regularity, parallelism, account for the most of what is characteristic of poetic language. Short, uh, a critic, short, in 1996 points out that deviation and parallelism are based on linguistic choice. In deviation, the authors choose a structure which violates some norm system, which very often is the system of rules provided by their language. In parallelism, in parallelism, they do not deviate from the linguistic norm system. Instead, they use the same structure more than once in a short space. In both cases, the choices may produce the effect of foregrounding. Third, uh, Mukarowski in 1970 suggests aesthetic values as another way in which poetic and standard language differ. In the arts, aesthetic valuation necessarily stands highest in the hierarchy of the values contained in the work, whereas outside of art, its position vacillates and is usually subordinate. In 2002, Verdonk mentions the following as the characteristics of the language of poetry. Its meaning is often ambiguous and elusive. It may flout the conventional rules of grammar. It has a peculiar sound structure. It is spatially arranged in metrical lines and stanzas. It often reveals foregrounded patterns in its sounds, vocabulary, grammar, or syntax. And last but not least, it frequently contains indirect references to other texts. As for the distinction between the language of poetry and that of prose, Stankiewicz in 1960 asserts that poetic language differs from prose primarily through the rules of organization of the message, which acquires autonomous value and which must be distinguished from the individual and non-replicable speech act. In addition, he states that the highest form of poetic organization, verse, differs from prose in its rhythmic pattern. Rhythm implies recurrence of certain elements within regularly distribute time intervals. The rules of distribution of these elements along the syntagmatic axis, which are obligatory for a given language or for a given period, constitute a system or systems of verification. The linguistic code determines both the selection and distribution of these signals. Stylistic analysis. Generally, in looking at a style in a text, what is of interest to the analyst is not choices in isolation, but rather a pattern of choices, something that characterizes the text as a whole, large and short. In 1981, for instance, the choice between active and passive sentences, saying persuasion was written by Jane Austen. In preference to Jane Austen wrote, persuasion could scarcely be called a style. On the other hand, if a text shows a pattern of unusual preference for passives over actives, This preference is considered a feature of a style. This does not mean that stylistics is uninterested in local features of a text, but rather that local or specific features have to be seen in relation to other features against the background of the pervasive tendency of preferences in the text. The recognition of cohesion and consistency in preference is important. Without it, one would scarcely acknowledge a style. To go to go one stage further, consistency and tendency are most naturally reduced to frequency, and so it appears the stylistician becomes a statistician. The linguist C.H. Hackett argues that poem is a long idiom, an utterance with a total meaning which is not merely the sum of meanings of its separate components. So, an account of a poem so, an account of a poem cannot be merely an inventory of its parts, but must involve also a statement of the network of relations between the parts. The linguist must make a whole analysis of the literary text and must then proceed to utilize his analyzed and understood fragments as elements in a synthesis. Relations within each level must be explored. For example, the linguist must relate his isolated grammatical statements to one another and must be prepared to describe points of contact between levels of a form to connect grammatical with phonological details. Widdowson in 1992 suggests that a general feature of poetry is that it cannot be interpreted by a direct application of conventional logic. This is because it normally represents an experience which is out of ordinary, and to express such experience, ordinary language and logic need to take a different shape. Conventional patterns of thought and expression should be disrupted and reformulated into patterns which follow different principles of order. Day by day we all miss her. Words would fail our loss to tell, but in heaven we hope to meet her evermore, with her to dwell. This is lines from Widdowson. Carter and Simpson in 1989 warned against too narrow a focus on linguistic forms, which they claim does not reveal what is significant in the study of literary texts. The effects which arise when linguistic forms implicate aspects of context or when they signal directly or indirectly the many functions they can be made to perform. This is no way indicates that grammatical or phonological forms of literary texts are not of interest. It suggests that they involve microstructural aspects of text. Now, stylistic analysis of poetry. The interest in the study of literary language in general and poetic language in particular has taken different forms, ranging from analysis concerned with illustrating how language is patterned in literary texts through analysis showing how such language patterning contributes to the meaning of the text, to those which are wholly dedicated to relate interpretation to a stylistic analysis and call for doing beyond the text itself to include all aspects thought to be relevant, which are normally subsumed under the heading of context. There is a brief look at representatives of the approaches just mentioned. Halliday's model. In his descriptive linguistics in literary studies, Halliday analyzes Yeats, Leda, and the Swan to see how it exemplifies the system of language. In his view, the description of the linguistic elements that occur in a piece of writing, the account of how it exemplifies the system of language is part of the analysis of the piece of writing as a literary work. He describes how two parts of the system of English are exemplified in Yeats's poem. The first being the nominal group and the second the verbal group. He is mostly concerned with the functions the definite article has within the nominal group. He notices a discrepancy between the forms of the nominal groups he has identified and the functions they appear to have in the poem. Thus, he concludes that this part of the system, that is, the nominal groups, is being used in a somewhat an unusual way without trying to pinpoint the literary effect behind that. In other words, while the analysis provides an accurate specification of how linguistic elements are exemplified, it does not lead to interpretation. It may be regarded as part of literary criticism only if the significance of its findings are investigated and hypotheses are made as to what contribute to an understanding of the literary work as a discourse. Thorne's model. In his article Stylistics and Generative Grammars, Thorne in 1970 argues against applying the grammar of ordinary language in the analysis of poetry. For him, this will result either in a grammar generating a vast number of unwanted sentences or a grammar containing statements so complex that they become virtually meaningless. He therefore suggests an alternative approach. Given a text containing sequences which resist inclusion in grammar of English, it might prove more illuminating to regard it as a sample of a different language or dialect from standard English. The syntactical preoccupation of stylistics are to be satisfied not by adjusting a grammar of standard English so as to enable it to generate all the actual sentences of the poem, but by finding the grammar which most adequately describes the structure of this language. He illustrates his model by considering the deviations from the forms from the norms of the standard language which usually occur in poetry, namely those found in Cummings' poem "Anyone Lived in a Pretty How Town." For more about the model, Sinclair model. Sinclair's model. Under the title Taking a Poem to Pieces, Sinclair carries out a linguistic analysis of one of Larkin's poems, First Sight. His hypothesis is that the grammatical and other patterns are giving meaning in a more complex and tightly packed way than we expect from our familiarity with traditional methods of describing language. He focuses on the grammar of the poem, particularly sentences, clauses, and groups phrases. He discusses in detail the various structural types of each of these grammatical units as they are exemplified in the poem and comments on the meanings they contribute in the poem. This analysis, he says, shows how some aspects of the meaning of the poem can be described quite independently of evaluation. For the whole analysis, see Fowler. Short's model. In Prelude 1, to a literary linguistic stylistics which presents an analysis of a section of one of T.S. Eliot's poem. A short describes his approach as that of using stylistic analysis as a means of supporting a literary or interpretive thesis. He claims that his analysis uses linguistic information but makes purely literary points as well. This analysis begins with giving an overall interpretation of the poem, which is to be backed up by more detailed analysis. Thus, linguistic detail is used only where it is relevant for the purposes of the literary argument. Um, Leach's model. In his article Language and Interpretation, Leach in 1970 asserts and critical linguistic description and critical interpretation are distinct and complementary ways of explaining a literary text. He argues that a work of literature contains dimensions additional to those operating in other types of discourse. The apparatus of linguistic description is an insensitive tool for literary analysis unless it is adopted to handle these extra complexities. He mentions four such dimensions: cohesion, foregrounding, and cohesion of foregrounding, and finally, context of situation. To begin with, cohesion is the way in which independent choices in different points of a text correspond with or purposes one another, forming a network of sequential relations. Cohesion is achieved either by grammatical devices, grammatical cohesion, or by lexical devices, a lexical cohesion. Secondly, foregrounding or motivated deviation from linguistic or other socially accepted norms has been claimed to be a basic principle of aesthetic communication. It is valuable, if not essential, for the study of poetic language. Thirdly, foregrounded features identified in isolation should be related to one another and to the text in its entirety. And this Leach calls cohesion of foregrounding. Sorry. Features related to the above mentioned dimensions are part of the meaning of the poem. They are the matters of linguistic choice and can be described in terms of the categories of. But in the broader sense, meaning is whatever is communicated to this or that reader. It includes the factor of interpretation. If the task of linguistic exegesis exegesis is to describe the text. That of critical exegesis is from one point of view to explore and evaluate possible interpretations of the text. The interpretation of the whole poem is built up from a consistency in the interpretation of individual features. But there is another aspect of a poem which requires interpretation, its implication of context, which is the fourth dimension. A normal discourse operates within a describable communicative situation from which an important part of its linguistic meaning derives. In literature, it is usually true to say that such contextual information is largely irrelevant. Instead, we have to construct a context by inference from the text itself by asking such questions as who are the I and the you of the poem, and what circumstances are they communicating. Now, let us discuss some aspects of lyrical poetry. Poetry can be classified into narrative and lyric. While narrative poems stress action, lyrics stress songs. These two types have many divisions. Narrative poetry includes the epic, romance ballad. Lyric poetry includes the elegy and epigraph, sonnet and sestina, Albeit and Villanelli. Moreover, each major types adheres to different conventions. Narrative poems, for example, tell stories and describe actions. Lyric poems combine speech and song to express feeling in varying degree of verbal music. On the contrary to narrative poetry, in lyrical poetry, story is subordinated to song and action to emotion. Lyrics are subjective poems, often brief, that express the feeling and thoughts of a single speaker who may or may not be represent the poet. Lyric poetry is typically characterized by brevity, melody, and emotional intensity. The music of lyrics makes them memorable, and their brevity contributes to the intensity of their emotional expression. Forms of lyric poetry range from the epigram, a brief, witty poem that is often satirical, to the elegy, a lament for the dead. Lyric forms also include the ode, a long stately poem in stanzas of varied length, meter, and form, and the obit, a morning love song as opposed to a serenade, which is in the evening, or a song or a poem about lovers separating at dawn. The tones, moods, and voices of lyric poems are as variable and as complexly intertwined as human feeling, thought, and imagination allow. Generally considered the most compressed poetic type, the lyric poem typically expresses much a little. Methodology. Since the development of stylistics as a recognized discipline, there have been a large number of models proposed to approach the language of texts, whether literary or non literary. The aim of these models is to identify certain linguistic features which can be considered characteristic of some author, period, genre, etc. Such models fall into two major categories: those which are mainly concerned with the literary texts and those which focus on non literary texts, though they are some which can be applied to both categories of texts. Some models constitute whole books like Crystal and Davis in 1969, which deal with almost with all varieties of language except literature. Other models are chapters in books or articles presented at symposiums or conferences such as those reviewed in above. Most of these models are devised to investigate single texts and sometimes one stylistic level. Some are comprehensive enough to include all the stylistic levels and thus can be applied to whatever text one wishes to explore. A representative model of the latter category is that of Leach in 1969, which is claimed to be, by its author, an outline of linguistic resources available for poets to draw upon in writing their poems. Simpson also presents a model which accommodates all the stylistic levels, particularly focusing on those features that are stylistically most significant at each level. Another model is that of Thornborough and Waring, which presents an account of the levels of language which can be experimented with by the authors to create literary effects before presenting the model adopted in the study. It is necessary to highlight the requirements that any stylistic model should meet to be accepted as a proper method of analysis. Requirements of stylistic models. Stylisticians have laid down some requirements or principles which any stylistic linguistic model should meet if it is to yield proper descriptions of style in any kind of text, whether literary or otherwise. Inquist in 1973 lists such requirements which include the capacity of the model to allow for linguistic variation and admit systematic description and classification of contextual categories, consistency in that both text and norm have to be described in terms sufficiently similar and consistent to permit comparison, adequacy in that the linguistic model must be capable of describing all relevant style markers. The last requirement is objectivity in the sense that anybody who repeats the analysis of the same materials by the same methods must arrive at the same result. Simpson also outlines some principles that the practice of stylistics should conform to. He specifies three such principles, referring to them as RS, which stipulate that stylistic analysis should be rigorous, analysis should be retrievable, stylistic analysis should be replicable. He goes on to explain what each one of these principles mean. Rigorous means that it should be based on an explicit framework of analysis. Retrievable means that the analysis is organized through explicit terms and criteria, the meanings of which are agreed upon by other students of stylistics. Replicable simply means that the methods should be sufficiently transparent as to allow other stylisticians to verify them, either by testing them on the same text or by applying them beyond that text. Stylistic levels. Since stylistics uses linguistic models and theories in analyzing texts, it makes use of categories, levels, and units already recognized in the study of language that can help organize and shape a stylistic analysis. Simpson asserts that language is an intricate web of levels, layers, and links. Thus, he adds, any utterance or piece of text is organized through several distinct levels of language. He gives a list of the major levels of language and their related technical terms in language study, along with a brief description of what each level covers. Level of language, branch of language study, the sound of spoken language, the way words are pronounced, phonology and phonetics. The patterns of written language, the shape of language on the page, that is called graphology, the way words are constructed words and their constituent structures, that is called morphology, the way words combine with other words to form phrases and sentences, that is called syntax and grammar, the words we use, the vocabulary of a language, lexicology, the meaning of words and sentences, semantics, the way words and sentences are used in everyday situations, pragmatics, the meaning of language is context, discourse analysis. Simpson remarks that these basic levels of language can be identified and teased out in the stylistic analysis of text, which in turn makes the analysis itself more organized and principled, more in keeping, so to speak, with the principle of the three R's. However, what is absolutely central or to our understanding of a language and style, he maintains, is that these levels are interconnected. This means that they interpenetrate and depend upon one another, and they represent multiple and simultaneous linguistic operations in the planning and production of an utterance. At each level, linguistic features that can be regarded as stylistics are identified and examined for their possible effect. In other words, the choice of features for analysis depends on how they contribute to the overall meaning of the poem. Model of analysis. The model proposed for the analysis of the data in the current study is an eclectic one. It consists of three parts. The first part considers rhyme and meter and is mainly based on Thornborough and Waring's. The second part deals with lexical categories of noun, verb, and adjective. The idea of having lexical categories in the model is borrowed from Leach and Short. But the theoretical background for these categories and their subcategories is based on Biber, Conrad, and Leach. The third part of the model investigates foregrounding in the data, namely the figures of parallelism, repetition, metaphor, and simile. All these parts of the model are supplemented by material from Arabic resources so as to account for the Arabic data. Below is an okay meter. Now come to meter. Definition of meter. Meter is literary device that works as a structural element in poetry. Essentially, meter is the basic rhythmic structure of a line within a poem or a poetic work. Meter functions as a means of imposing a specific number of syllables and emphasis when it comes to a line of poetry that adds to its musicality. It consists of the number of syllables and the pattern of emphasis on those syllables. In addition, a meter governs individual units within a line of poetry called feet. A foot of a poetic work features a specific number of syllables and pattern of emphasis. Perhaps the most famous example of poetic meter is Iambic Pentameter. An iamb is a metrical foot that consists of one short or unstressed syllable followed by a long or stressed syllable. The structure of iambic pentameter features 5 iambs per line or 10 total syllables per line. All the even numbered syllables in this metric form are stressed. Shakespeare is well known for his use of literary device, especially in his sonnets. Here is an example from Sonnet 104. To me, fair friend, you never can be old. For as you were when first your eye eyed, such seems your beauty still. Three winters cold have from the forests shook 3 summers pride. Each line features 5 iambs that follow the pattern of unstressed and stressed syllables, common examples of metrical feet. For English poetry, metrical feet generally feature 2 or 3 syllables. They are categorized by a specific combination of stressed and unstressed syllables. The most common examples of metrical feet include trochee, a stressed syllable followed by unstressed syllable, as in custom, custom, custom. So the stress is on the first syllable. I am a unstressed syllable followed by a stressed syllable, as in describe.